Okay, some people are in, which is great. Hello, people. Thank you for joining us. We've got an hour, so we're going to really get moving. There's some names there I recognise, which is great. Let's have a few more, come along. Brilliant. I'm Neal Lawson. I'm the Executive Director of Compass. I'm really pleased to be chairing this session today, of which we've got now 5 brilliant but quick and imaginative and insightful speakers. We have none less than Steve Reed, who's the Shadow Labour spokesperson for Communities and Local Government. We had Darren Rodwell, who's the leader of Barking and Dagenham Council, who we've been working with. Then we have Hannah O'Rourke, who runs a brilliant organisation called Labour Together that's been doing some fantastic work. And then no, it's not last. Then we have Anna Randle, who's the Chief Executive of an even, well, not even better, but equally brilliant organisation called Collaborate that's been doing some fantastic work with councils across the country. And then a late addition is Colin Miller, who chairs and runs a Deeper Democracy group for Compass, and he's just going to outline some thoughts about what he thinks Labour needs to do in order to prosecute a more effective participatory politics. So just before I hand over to Steve, just set the scene really quickly. Look, we're not going to be in government until 3 or 4 years' time, unfortunately. So our councils, like Darren's in Barking and Dagenham and the other places that that Hannah and Steve and Anna and Colin are working with, are absolutely central to the defence of people's interests between now and then. But not only that, what we do is we prefigure the kind of government that we want to run after the next election. We show that we trust the people, we show that we believe participation is the best way to do things, that collaboration in the face of complexity is the only way to get things done. And what we do over the next 3 or 4 years is try to experiment and test and build ways of doing that, so that not only now do we help people, but we have a way of governing and running things with the people, for the people, not to the people, when we get into office in 4 years' time. So this is absolutely, incredibly, critical, central work to our politics. And what we want to try and do out of this gathering today is to begin to build a group of councils, thinkers like Anna and Colin and Hannah and others, and really build the intellectual and institutional architecture of how we govern and how we develop that relationship between the council and civil society, and see how well we can nail that over the next couple of years. So we'd be delighted to work with a whole lot of other organisations in trying to do that. Steve Reed has been doing this for ages. He's doing it now. He needs to do it on acid, not acid, because that's not very Labour, is it? But on stilts. So over to you, Steve. What you're thinking. Thanks, mate.
Thank you. No, I'm staying off the drugs, particularly for the Compass session that we're in now. But thank you very much for the suggestion, Neal.
And just say it is being recorded. It is being recorded, so that's a good thing. And we'll use this and put this out later, afterwards, so that we can use this with a lot more people. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, you delete that bit first then. What better way to? I'm delighted to be part of such an illustrious panel, but what better way to start the proceedings at a Compass event than to quote the great Neal Lawson back at him? So, citizen empowerment isn't part of the story, it is the story. And I profoundly believe that to be true at a time when trust in democracy and our democratic institutions is breaking, not just in the United Kingdom, but in many advanced democracies around the world. We need to find a way to stop the drift towards the populist nationalist right and the model of the strong man who offers simplistic answers to everything pretty much by blaming other people, usually the weak and the vulnerable, for what's going wrong. We have to remake democracy in a way that people can believe in, and that means rebuilding it around people themselves and the communities that they are part of. And that means giving people a voice and the power to assert it in the workplace, in the community, and over the public services that they use. For me, that is the agenda we need to be developing as we move towards the next election, so that we can talk about it with examples at the next election, so that people understand quite how transformative it can be. Now, through all the horrors of the last few months of COVID-19, there have been 1 or 2 flashes of brightness that give us an insight into how things might be different in the future. And one of those was the way that local authorities were able to, at pace, do things for the past decade we've been told couldn't be done, and they were done in a matter of weeks. Services were joined up and connected across organisations in just a matter of weeks. A digitised front end was created so that many more people could participate or access services and information online. And we developed in communities right across the country a community-owned and community-led front end in mutual aid groups, connected to but separate from the public services they were supporting. This is transformational, and all of it is giving us insights into how different things could be if we had a more participatory, responsive form of democracy and delivery of our public services. And what I think this speaks to, and the questions that we need to answer if we want to make this happen more widely, is how do we address the inequality of power that leaves so many people in our country at the mercy of decisions taken about them by others, rather than being able to participate themselves and feeling in a very real way that they can shape their own lives rather than have their lives shaped for them. On the Labour Party, we talk an awful lot about the more visible inequalities of wealth, health, opportunity we see all around us, but we don't talk enough about the inequalities of power that hold people back from addressing these more visible inequalities that really do constrain and hold back people's lives. So I think we need to be talking about addressing the inequality of power with a new settlement between citizens and the state, whether that's at a national or local level, that puts the citizen in the driving seat. It's part of how we can rebuild trust in our democracy, not by just clinging on to what we've had for the last few decades, at least until the crash, but reframing our democracy, rewiring it around people. Now, in terms of national policy, that means getting powers out of Whitehall, certainly through models of devolution, but it requires double devolution. We can't just shift powers from Whitehall to the town hall. Town halls have to be empowering their communities, and I think they're best placed to do this as well because they're closer to them and they understand them. So devolution, yes, but also citizen empowerment going alongside that. One aspect I think we've neglected for decades in our political discourse is the relative disempowerment of the public service user compared to the public service provider. Whether that provider is in the private sector or the public sector, we very often don't recognise the need to give the citizen, the service user, the tenant, the young person whose life is going off the rails because they're getting involved in violence, the older or disabled person that needs care services. We don't give them a voice and support them to articulate that voice in choosing the things that will affect their life in the future. And for me, that is what empowerment is. It's doing things with people instead of doing things to people. It's a very simple phrase to utter, but it's a very, very profound concept that could be transformative if we can put that at the centre of a democratic renewal that I think is necessary if we're going to rebuild the shattered trust in our democracy. It's a very exciting agenda. There's a lot of people all over the country that are doing this in different ways in different communities. We've never assembled them together into a movement. I think Compass has done a sterling job in starting to make that happen. But I genuinely believe the future of the Labour Party and the future of the country lies in tackling the inequality of power, opening up power to everybody in this country, supporting people who are less and more vulnerable to have the capacity to participate, whether that's their local council or a local advocacy group that helps them to do it. But the day of the top-down state is gone. This is the era of bottom-up democracy, and I think we need to be at the centre of making it happen.
The centre and the periphery and everywhere, because the centre is no longer there, Steve. Brilliant, stirring stuff, and it's that cultural shift we need. And to shift now from that over to a real brilliant specific of this, I'm delighted we've got Darren with us to tell us about the Citizens Alliance network that they've been developing in Barking and Dagenham. And I've put in the chat, if you want to have a look, the as yet unpublished, but will be published report that we've done on the work that Darren and his team have been doing down in Barking and Dagenham. So over to you, Darren, to tell us a bit about that specific. Thank you for being here, mate.
Thanks a lot, Neil, and thank you for everyone who's taken the time to be on this. And again, I couldn't agree more with Steve in his opening remarks. I think we have the ultimate battle now, if you want to talk left and right. and that is our view that every citizen should have a value, a say in society, and a conservative view that basically the Normans were right, so we should have barons, because with elected mayors there is no democracy, because once every 4 years they will be able to, you know, tell the peasants to vote for them again. So I think it's a real crucial time in local government that we really do bring out the alternative. And in fact, for the Labour movement, I think there's never been a better time for this, because as Steve remarked as well, a lot has already been happening around the country, whether it be the Wigan deal or the Plymouth Pound and all the other bits that have been going on. We've had the Citizens Alliance Network, and that is born out of the fact that we, as you all know, had a big issue with the far right in this borough. In fact, we didn't have an issue with the far right. They came and took an opportune moment from the fact that a whole borough felt disenfranchised from where government was. And remember, this was in a new Labour government. So it shows you how far away we'd come away from working class people. And I say that because even though we are based in East London, we have more in common with the northern towns and the valleys than we do with our friends in London. We are the 9th most deprived area in the country, and we are the most deprived in London. So where did we start? Well, we started listening. We apologise first and foremost to our residents back when we were fighting the BNP running up to 210. We knocked 163,000 doors. We spoke to 65,000 people. More importantly, though, we listened to their aspiration, where they wanted to go. And that led us into developing a program where we did a borough manifesto, where we carried on that dialogue about what were the 10 key things that mattered to them and how they felt about their community. So we broke it down into 2 very easy, understandable areas. It was about the people or the place. And we set our council up to run in that way. We involved Participatory City, which is everyone every day, which led to then the Good Neighbour Guide. It meant about what we could do for one another. Now, all of this then led to a document called New East, New Thinking. And if you want to have a look at it, it's neweastnewthinking.com. And it talks about residents' aspiration being a triangle and the top of it, the council there to facilitate their aspiration, and also their job was to find the right partners to invest in that aspiration. In that document, it talks about the Barking and Dagenham Citizens Alliance Network. In short, that's just a brand meaning community, because every person, as I said before, should have a place in society, and that's where we've started. We have the most diverse council in London. We have a very great interaction with our community. When COVID struck, we were able to set up in 10 days the ability for a network of 85 organisations in the borough supporting our community of around 30,000 people on a weekly basis. That is an incredible statistic to be able to say. But basically what we did was we developed and empowered and facilitated the network to manage itself. Now, it's a very interesting argument about where this goes, because councils traditionally and government nationally have always been we lead. Well, actually there's two types of leading. Sorry about that. I should have put my phone on silent. There's 2 types of leading. There's leading from the front and leaving everyone else behind, or there's leading with people beside you. And the great thing about our movement is we've always done the best in society when we've led with everyone alongside us. And that is the framework we now use in Barking and Dagenham. And I often say, because we had to start with the organisations because of COVID, it's a bit like Star Wars. We started with episodes 4, 5 and 6 rather than 1, 2 and 3. So we're now pulling it back a bit to make sure that every person that was supported and has been supported and continues to get support from these different groups are now invited to have a voice on the platform that allows them to build the framework that councillors as community leaders now adopt in their respective communities. So it's a bit of a sort of a wild thing to try and ascertain, but it is everything we believe in. It is about every citizen having the right to have their say and to be heard, more importantly, and have an input in governance moving it forward. So I don't know if there was a link, but I'm sure we can get the link up there for people to have more of a read. But I'm probably better to take questions, if that's all right, Neal, because I know we're short of time.
Brilliant, brilliant. I don't know whether to call you Darren or Han Solo now, but either will do. The link is up there, Darren. People can read that in a bit more detail and then ask any questions. So, Hannah, over to you. Clearly, the party itself has got to change, and it's got to change its culture. And that's what Labour Together is all about. So, how is that happening? Where is that happening? What does that mean?
Thanks, Steve. And also loving the Star Wars references, Darren. I think they're great. So what I suppose I'd start off by saying is that we recently did a review into the 2019 general election, and I cannot understate how big the political challenge is for Labour in terms of winning back and connecting with communities. That lack of trust that's there is going to be really hard to win back. So I think we all need to just remember that this is a pretty key existential challenge for Labour, and the more that we can understand how to kind of embed these methods of participation and connection, the more likely we're going to overcome it. Just to give you an example, sort of Stoke-on-Trent, we started off by losing the council in 2015, then we lost our first MP in 2017, then we lost our other 2 MPs in 2019, and this was a city that had only ever voted Labour. So this just gives you a sense of like how deep that disillusionment goes. So I think anything where we're kind of looking at how to rebuild that trust and those links with communities is really, really important. I think the second thing I'd like to say is how much of this is like happening outside of Labour, like all these community groups, all these spaces that are being built and coming up. It's all at the moment not necessarily happening within our party, which I think is a real problem that we have to get to grips with. We have to ask ourselves, why are people not coming to Labour to do this kind of work? Why are we not open to this? And again, I think a lot of that comes back to, as Neal said, culture. So one of the things we've been wrestling with in our sort of workshops, looking at our review and the changes we want to see within the Labour Party, is at the moment Labour is kind of beset by factionalism. It's very procedural. We're very motion-led. There's lots of gatekeeping. We're all about asking permission. Nobody kind of does anything. And these are not the tools, and it's not the way we want our political party to be set up if we're going to do any of this kind of work. And it's great to see councils doing that, but I think the missing part in a lot of this is actually our local parties and how we bring them into this picture. So I think that's a big question that we've got. And there are some really good bits of practice actually going on. I can see that Jane's on the call here. So Broxtowe Labour Party have done amazing things in terms of running their own community hub and kind of like co-designing services and doing everything from cooking lessons all the way to providing back to school kits. That is an amazing example of this happening. I've come across a few more in our workshops, but there are kind of tiny patches of this happening. I think the biggest thing for us is how do we connect this all up and make this like an embedded part of Labour politics and the Labour movement's politics, because historically it always was. We were kind of born of the trade unions, the cooperative movement, like we do things with people, not just for people. And in some ways, I think the Labour Party has become a kind of husk on the top of nothing rather than a kind of an iceberg that has much more underneath it. And the more we can discover that and grow that, is like the biggest question for me. The final thing I guess I'd say is just what does this interface look like? And Neal talks a lot about 45-degree change, this idea of how do you interface between political parties and civil society. And I think there's lots of questions to be asked there. It sounds like amazing things were done in Barking and Dagenham over the mutual aid groups. But I guess what I'd like to say is, however we kind of work that through, this is happening out there and it's up to us whether we sort of get on board with it or we just kind of ignore it. But either way, people are creating power for themselves in forums, particularly local Facebook groups. I had a really interesting chat with one of our candidates in Teesside the other month, and she was telling me all about a a local Facebook group that when their buses stopped running, they came together to not only create a kind of petition to get the buses back, but also to start organising lifts for each other into the main town. So again, this kind of power is being organised. It's up to Labour whether we engage with it or not. And the question is, do people who organise these spaces then become our local councillors? Are we open to, like, how do we sort of engage with this in a kind of formal political way? And I think there's lots of unanswered questions that would be great to kind of explore. So lots of questions from me.
Thanks, Hannah. Great stuff. And again, it's the culture issue. And if the Labour Party doesn't, as everyone's saying, if the Labour Party doesn't switch this culture, it will get left behind because someone else will provide the culture of the 21st century. So the party has to move. So over to Anna, and how do we begin to piece some of this together, Anna? Because you think about this and work on this. Is there a kind of picture emerging which is starting to become coherent, do you think?
Yeah, I think there is. And it was so interesting listening to you talk there, Hannah, about whether the party kind of engages with the stuff that's actually emerging from the ground up, because I think that is a really good question. I think the future is there, it is emerging. We just need to kind of understand it and name it and kind of grow it really purposefully. And I suppose my other kind of response to what I heard from you, Hannah, was just that Labour local government is doing this work. In local government, it's happening. So, Steve was leading this agenda in Lambeth 10 years ago. If you look around the country, Barking and Dagenham, obviously another kind of really leading local authority, but Wigan, Oldham, lots up in Greater Manchester, Camden, also in London, Gateshead and others in the northeast. This is not a kind of set of really small isolated examples. I think this is an emerging kind of reform agenda that is being built from the ground up, and it's being built from the ground up because those people who are closest to communities understand that the age of deference is over. The complex challenges that we face as a society and in our localities are such that local government or any part of the local state is not going to be able to tackle those problems alone. We need to mobilise the energy, the ideas, the passion, the relationships, the networks, everything that exists within our communities that is part of that solution. And of course, the state has an important role to play, but it can't do it alone. So it's really interesting to me that I think the future has started to emerge, and it's done so organically in response to an assessment of the need for change, the way that the world is changing, the limits of old kind of more paternalistic approaches to government and to public services. And I'm just going to say, I think a little bit in response to austerity as well, which kind of forced some radical thinking about a change to the way that we operate in local government, certainly. I think it's really interesting, this kind of question about what happened in the pandemic. I think in the pandemic, we did see a huge acceleration of collaboration between the state locally, largely local government, but other bits of the public sector as well, and between communities and the voluntary sector, sort of civil society more broadly. And we saw that take place at scale and at pace. And that was because we were in a kind of unique climate where everyone was able to, put aside the old kind of enmities and issues and just kind of mobilise in this great sense of shared purpose, which really interestingly, what I observed was that shared purpose wasn't a sort of broad thing about the whole community. Actually, the thing that really bound people together was protecting the most vulnerable people in the community who really needed support, with medication or food or, isolation or whatever it was. And I think that what happened is that the community, civil society, was able to step forward and offer things in that space that had always been there, but hadn't always been obvious to all of local authorities. And suddenly, the kind of case for that collaboration and that case for like that bottom-up mobilisation has become very clear to everyone. And certainly what we've observed is that places like Barking and Dagenham, who had already been investing in those relationships, building the infrastructure for collaboration across the place, were able to mobilise quicker. And those places that hadn't been investing in that have had to kind of get with the programme quite quickly, but I think they have done that. And I think that creates an enormous opportunity from where we are now. We've all worked in a different way. We've got 6 months under our belt of working in a different way. So the question really is, how are we going to build on that? I'm really sorry about my cat. She's meowing in the background, if you can hear that. So the other thing that I just kind of wanted to say in conclusion really was just that I think we have seen a huge acceleration of this collaboration with communities and between local government and communities through COVID. but it was an acceleration of something that was there already. It was an emerging change in the way that we think about public services. It was in response to an assessment of the challenges that we face and the limits of a traditional approach to government and public services. And so I think that, you know, what we're seeing emerging is new approaches to how we kind of share and think about power. I think new relationships between institutions and communities, but based on this idea of reciprocity and social responsibility. It's not just about rights. I think we are seeing a greater kind of willingness and ambition to collaborate, to tackle these complex problems, and to build institutions that are ready and able to work collaboratively and have different behaviours, different culture, understand what it really means to work through networks and to mobilise people and to convene rather than to control. And certainly I think the other thing, the final thing I would say about local government and the councils that are thinking in this way, Barking and Dagenham is a brilliant example, is that they are thinking well beyond the traditional role of local government. You know, this is no longer about good service delivery or just efficient service delivery. Of course, that's really critical, but services need to be reshaped as well in terms of this agenda. And it's about people, and it's about place, and it's about what do people need in order to live well in a place. And that is about a completely different relationship, different way of working. So it's all there for the taking. The question I think for all of us is, you know, what do we do with it next, and how do we build it? How do we grow it? And how do we not try to control it, I think, as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. I don't know whether the cat was agreeing or disagreeing with you. I think the cat was almost certainly agreeing with every word that you were saying. Fantastic. And that thing about the adrenaline rush, I mean, that may or may not be over, but as you say, this is all part of bubbling up emerging trends, which all should be in Labour's favour in terms of they're more democratic, they're more egalitarian, they've got sustainability built into them, they've got purpose built into them. If we can align ourselves with that wave of energy and capacity, then there will be absolutely no stopping us. And it's whether the party can adjust itself to all of that energy and creativity is the question. Colin, over to you, just to give us a quick summary of the thinking and the work of the Deeper Democracy Group, which aligns with all of this, doesn't it?
Sorry. I've just been doing some work for a chapter on a book, and I just wanted to bring to people's attention a couple of statistics. The last general election, the overall turnout was 67.3%. The lowest turnout of any constituency was 56%. The highest, and I think it was in Twickenham, was 78%. It's very rare for local elections to have anything more than 30%. The last figures for the 2019 local elections, the turnout for that was 29.3%. In one particular ward, the turnout was 15%. And I think that tells you something about the kind of crisis of democracy that we're facing. But as someone once said, that the way that we protect democracy is with more democracy. And I think we're living in an exciting moment. The stuff you guys have been talking to about now and what's going on in local government, it's actually a worldwide movement. New municipalism is happening everywhere. It's happening in Spain, it's happening in Latin America, it's happening in America through the Fearless Cities movement, as well as through the cooperative council movement. So we're living in a worldwide movement of ideas about citizen empowerment, and I think that's brilliant. The Deeper Democracy Group really came about by a bunch of people who've been doing this kind of from the inside. People who are involved in community development, community organising, and citizens' dialogue and that kind of thing, including people who organise citizens' assemblies. And we believe that it's really essential that Labour must introduce radical change in the way that our democracy works when it can. And that PR, proportional representation, whilst is to us probably necessary, is not sufficient. You need much deeper democracy than just PR. It must include participation and deliberation in the planning and the decision makings at the core of what government does, not on the periphery, but in the core of the way in which councils make their decisions and the way in which our government makes its decisions. So we produced a pamphlet, and hopefully Grace can share the link to that called Participation at 45 Degrees, Techniques for Citizen-Led Change, because our experience comes from how do you make this work? What's our insights as people who do this stuff about what works and doesn't work, and our ideas of how to make it work. And so we welcome the current interest in citizens' assemblies and the development of new municipalism. And it is part of a worldwide movement, but it needs to be more systematic. What is key for us in all of this, and I say this as a challenge for local government in particular, is that communities need to be given the resources to be able to speak with an independent voice. So it's not about co-option into what the council wants. It's about citizens and communities having an independent voice and working in collaboration and in participation with those local authorities. And that includes not silencing the unwanted voices, the voices that are inconvenient. Well, that's critically important if you want this to work. So we produced a mini manifesto, which we put on the website on Compass, which was a kind of appeal in particular to Labour about the sorts of things that need to be done now in COVID that we reckon as part of an overall thing. And if you could just quickly flash it on, Grace. Have you got it? I'll just
be relatively quick.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's only 7 things on it. Got it? I'll read it out. It's all right, don't worry.
Sure.
So we need a cross-party team to produce the community support plan. We need a community support plan. The agenda needs to be guided by a cross-assembly of community representatives. We must map what's been lost. We've had 10 years of austerity, which has trashed the support services that are there for communities, community centres, resources, training, grants, that kind of stuff. If we don't have that, they can't have an independent voice. We need a wider use of participatory practice in community development and community organising. And we need to increase the strength of the community infrastructure levy to ensure that communities can influence its use. Those are some of the key things that we will talk about in our group. So we think what's happening is brilliant, but we think there's still a lot of hard work to do.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that, Colin. I'm going to just, I'm trying to soak up the questions in the chat thing. So, and I'm going to start with some of the sort of some of the issue stuff, the difficult issue stuff, and just run around all of you. And it seems to me there were 3 things that were kind of mentioned really from the questions. How do we convince senior councillors and officials about this stuff who aren't convinced? How do we move from public services, being proper public services and not just producer services? And how do we do Colin's independent voice? And let me begin to answer those points by saying that always within Compass, we see things as combinations, not either or, but both and. So how do you have producers, and users of services? How do you have the community and the council? And I think some senior officers and senior councillors in other places are going to have to be persuaded about this stuff. So let's just do a quick run round of any answers to those bits if we could. Steve, do you want to just come in first on any thoughts about those kind of quite tricky issues?
Yeah, I mean, as Anna was actually working with me at Lambeth when we were the first council to designate ourselves a cooperative council, and we started feeling our way towards a lot of these issues. So many of the questions that have just come up were things that we were dealing with then, and I think started to resolve, and there's more people on the issue now. So it's quite interesting to see, to share some of this experience actually. But how do you convince councillors and perhaps some council officers that don't see the benefit in doing this? First of all, why don't they see the benefit? For an awful lot of people that are professionals in a particular sector, they spent decades getting to the top of the decision-making hierarchy, and people tend to think that the mechanism that's put them at the top must be a good mechanism because look who it's put in charge, and that can affect both councillors and council officers, but the problem isn't who gets to be the dictator. It's the fact that we have a dictatorship or a model of centralized control that can oppress the preferences, choices, and insights that people have into their own lives. So how do you overcome that? You have to, whole organizational change at once is too traumatic for organizations to bear, is what I believe. So you don't attempt to shift an entire organization over to this at once. You take a number of services or examples. They may be council-led. In some cases, they won't be. They might be in civil society or the voluntary sector. And you show how co-production techniques, empowering the service user as well as the service provider, respecting that each party has something of value to bring into the decision, can transform the outcome. The people that have experienced co-production, which is it's not a specific way of doing things, it's not a model, it's an approach. People that have experienced it often become evangelical about how powerful and transformative it can be. You take those examples, you show other people how it's affected their life, they then go back and apply it in their own life. But you do need support from the top, willing to accept this change, but you also need support and challenge from the bottom up, because that is where the power is going to shift to. So I think the key thing there is it's never going to be a whole system change all at once. You've got to find the examples, tie them up together. And that's what I meant about building a movement around this thing. There's lots of us that get this, lots of people that don't. Let's work together to convince.
Yeah, I agree. Coalition of the willing we need. And Darren, you've faced a lot of these problems, haven't you? Tell us how you're getting through them.
So look, I mean, we faced a community that didn't feel valued. And I was reading some of the bits about how does the Labour Party, the members and the council, you know, they're different organisations. No, they're not. We're one and the same. And if we are different, that's because what we've done is we've siloed ourselves in thinking that we're the important part, when actually it's got to be a collective good that's going to make that change. And that's what we did here in Barking and Dagenham. When I was, again, going back to the history always shows you the future. And in Barking and Dagenham, the average age of a member that was active, and I use that term loosely, was in their 70s. In fact, the head of regeneration was 89 on the council. And it was all ex-industrial people that worked in Fords or blue-collar type jobs. And there's nothing wrong with that, except if you've got a whole council that is just that one type of person, you're only ever going to come out with one type of answer. What we've done is, as I said before, we are the most demographically representative in London as a council. And we're really proud of that fact. And 42% of our councillors are female. We want to get that to 50%, 60% on my cabinet. I have 2 deputies, 1 male, 1 female. Really important that we show that diversity is the strength we need. And that has to be also in the movement. So again, we have open meetings. We don't do this stuff with GCs and ECs. That's combined as one, because that's the operation of the party. What we want is the aspiration of the party to be able to come through using the network of community, because all of us come from a community. And it's how do we develop that in saying and facilitating that voice, because good leadership should be solid enough to feel that actually our job is to promote others into improving the situation they find themselves and others in. And that's what we've tried to do. And I say, I know Steve has been, I nearly said an old hand. He's not an old hand, he's an experienced hand in this work. And I think that's the real key, and that's the difference between us and the Conservatives, because it's very clear to me the Conservatives really do want to take us back in time, and we will end up being the peasants. And I did see there's some friends of ours from the Liberal Democrats. I would say come into the party that represents the masses, and actually that's the way we will actually sort out the red wall, because there never was a red wall. There never was a safe seat. You know, there is a graphic equalizer of what people's personal feelings were about the situation they found themselves in. And I think too many people have found themselves to be scared because of austerity. And we need to be the party again of hope and aspiration in a realist sort of way. And I think that's what's so exciting about this project and what's happening in local government, because local government are the residents of that community. We're not separate. We've got to be one and the same.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Darren. You're moving from Han Solo to Yoda in one bit. All that wisdom. I mean, Hannah. I mean, answer what you want. But I mean, the Labour Party has to stop just being the party of Labour and being the party of the citizen. Is that true?
Yeah, I think we've got to change a lot of this. I find particularly for like Labour Together, it comes through like how you practice things. So a lot of this is in the doing. So like whenever I kind of think about how we're organising, I always ask myself sort of questions like, am I creating spaces for people to organise? Is there transparency around the decision that's being made? Are the people that will be kind of involved in this, are they creating it with me? Am I building the capacity for like a system or project to change if things change? And are people kind of able to equally participate? And are we letting go of control? And those kind of questions I kind of run through in my head. And I think we just need more people in the Labour Party running through those questions in their heads before they do things. So what I also think is really striking from this conversation is there's so many amazing things happening in Labour councils, and yet this feels completely disconnected from the Labour membership. And if you think about it, we have, 500,000 members now. That's 500,000 people. And at the moment, they're spending their time in meetings, fighting with each other, rather than out there helping to do this stuff. So I think it's such a huge culture change that's needed, but it starts with just like different forms of practice and just always asking ourselves those kind of questions to try and get ourselves out of that old mindset and into a slightly different one. But I think there's always going to be tensions, but it's about, as much as we can, changing that, how people are doing things and acting. Sorry, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, good. Again, it goes back to the culture stuff. Anna, over to you and answering some of those kind of tricky questions about independent voice, shifting officers and councillors, and shifting from, producer services to public.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was thinking, so Hannah, the questions that you just said you ask yourself are sort of the questions that everyone should always be asking themselves in all sorts of roles. I don't think they're really good questions. And the thing that I was thinking about when I was listening to some of the other panelists answer these questions was about what has enabled this to flourish in some places and what has stopped it in some others. And I was reflecting on the importance actually of not just political kind of leadership around this stuff that you've seen from the likes of Darren and Steve and others, but also the really close partnership between politicians and officers in these places. Actually, I don't think either can do it alone, but one of the things that I think is interesting about this agenda around sharing power with citizens is that there are a lot of converted officers as well out there. There are a lot of chief execs who believe that this is the right way to run an organisation in today's day and age. And so I think that collaboration between officer and member is really important. And I suppose the other sort of thing that I would say is sort of a bit of an obvious point really, but this is long-term culture change work in organisations that have been around for a long time, working with a different mindset and a different set of values and behaviours. And so it's not stuff that changes overnight, and we certainly learnt that in Lambeth, but you can stick to your guns and get quite far over a kind of 10-year period is what I would definitely say, having learnt from places like Oldham and Wigan and others. So, it's definitely worth the candle, but it's not gonna, it's not an overnight agenda.
And I think it is. I mean, perseverance is everything, Anna. But I guess things do change at scale and speed in ways they didn't in the past. You look at the COVID experience and how communities were mobilised and shifted. So I think we are in an era where big change can happen if we get the different elements of it right. Colin, was there anything you wanted to come back on quickly on any of those points?
Yeah, just a couple of points. One, I think it would be really helpful. This is probably going to be an unpopular idea, but I think it'd be really helpful for people to look back at the last Labour government and what they did in their community strategies, because some of the stuff they did was brilliant and some of the stuff they did was not so brilliant. But we've got so many lessons we can learn from what happened then, and we shouldn't just reject it because it happened to be run by a certain Prime Minister. The other thing I would say, one of the things that got me thinking about what we do and democracy is my experience in doing community development work. When Steve mentioned it earlier on about co-production, where often we've been working with communities very intensively with officers, creating brilliant ideas in local communities and neighbourhoods, only for those ideas to disappear into the town hall somewhere, never to be heard of again, or to be rejected, or to be changed. And you can't believe how angry that made local residents feel, and why should they believe in local government anymore if this is what happens to their ideas? So that was one of the things that really got me thinking about what we need to do. So all I would say very simply is, it's that we need to think about. It's not what we do with communities, it's what happens within the systems of the local authority. What happens to those ideas that come out of communities? That's the key for me.
Yeah, I agree that that's a challenge. Right, we're slightly running out of time, so I'm going to do one final whip round, and there's kind of two questions as part of this whip round, trying to pick up from the stuff in the chat from people like Peter and others. So there's a question about, do we need constitutional reform to get this far, to make change, which relies on a change of government in effect, because one of the big threats coming down the track that people have mentioned in the chat is the Tory idea of big unitary authorities. They're Darren's kind of, robber barons that are going to be put in place. So, do we need constitutional reform? Can we do things like the Citizens Alliance Network or other examples of more autonomous kind of new institutions can we build? So there's a kind of constitutional question of threats and opportunities. And then finally, what are the things that you really want Labour to do in order to, and you're in charge of it, Steve, so you can do whatever you want. What are the things you want Labour to do in order to kind of prosecute this kind of cultural, structural paradigm shift change in the way it sees power and its relationship with people and communities? So what's the big thing it needs to do? I'm just going to take you in kind of sort of slightly reverse order and start with you, Hannah, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, sure. Those are massive questions.
I know. We've only got a couple of minutes each.
I think the biggest thing for me is probably for Labour to take this form of politics on board, and to really pursue it as a kind of political vision. I think on a super practical level, I would like every MP, councillor, people in local parties to be involved in their local Facebook groups, just because I think that would even begin to open up those kind of links. But yeah, I think ideally we take this on as a kind of political mission. I think a lot more thought needs to be given to what that constitutional reform might look like. So maybe that's a task for the next 4 years. But yeah, those are kind of my rough thoughts on it.
Okay, brilliant. Anna, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is about supporting the local innovation that's already taking place, making space for it, celebrating it, learning from it, supporting the people who are leading it. So, like I said earlier, not trying to control it or kind of replace it with anything else, but allow it to be organic and emergent, but also to support that and create the conditions for it to flourish. I think there's a lot of sharing of learning to be done. There's, this is sort of emerging all over the place, and how do we kind of bring together the learning and make it a little bit more coherent? And I think that Labour in government, the role really is to understand what it will take to allow that to flourish. And I do think that there is a new kind of, devolution agenda emerging here that helps create the conditions for this sort of localism to flourish, or this new municipalism, or whatever we call it. But again, it's about listening to those people who are doing the work, understanding what they need, and creating the conditions for the work to grow.
Brilliant. And Colin, over to you quickly. And just if you can, could you respond to John Alexander's point in the chat thing? John is one of our friendly Liberal Democrats who are now facing left, not equidistant. I mean, do you think it has to be done with other people from other parties?
Oh yes, I mean, of course. I don't see how it could be done in any other way. I mean, I said it was a worldwide movement, and that means that there are people from all sorts of backgrounds, particularly the Green Movement, for example, Liberals as well as Socialists, who are involved in this. We share, anyone who shares a passion for democracy. I mean, you can't have, how could you do it in any other way without involving people? It's about democracy. So I don't think you could do, you have to include others. I'll just say one very brief thing. I think all I would say is my message to Labour now would be to let's start working with the communities to create the plan for community support. So when Labour gets into power, they have a plan that provides, develops something for community support to help develop resilient and empowered communities. If you can't do anything else, you should do that, I think.
Okay, and we like the word resourcefulness. You know, I mean, more than resilient, because it's much more kind of active and positive. I think that's what we want to create. Steve, I've got you up next.
Yeah, I mean, big. I mean, fantastic debate, and we need to continue it. I think you asked about constitutional reform. Do we need it, Neil? We don't. We can start going without constitutional reform, and you can go a certain distance without it, as Darren has shown us in B&D. You know, they're getting with it. Civil society organisations are getting on with this. But if we really want to transform the whole country, then we do need a government that wants to go the same place as well. It's because part of this is, in order to let people take back power, those that are hoarding it at the centre must either relinquish it or have it prized from their fingers. So I'd rather have a government that understood that resourceful, resilient, empowered communities will make better choices for themselves and therefore better choices for the country than civil servants or, even worse, Conservative ministers sitting in ivory towers in Whitehall. We've seen how badly wrong this has gone in COVID. Centralising decisions over testing failed, over track and trace failed, over PPE distribution failed, over messaging failed. They got it all wrong, and yet communities got so much of it right and would have done even more had the government not tried to hold centre power together at the centre. So you need a government to enact a model of not just devolution, but go further, empowerment of citizens, of service users, of workers in the workplace to deliver the fairer country that we want to see. And I genuinely believe I would like to see Labour now lead this debate, convene the space for this debate, not just for Labour, but for citizens, for the community, for activists, for practitioners, about how Labour in future can win an election, win power to give power away, because that's how we build a fairer Britain.
Brilliant, good line. Darren Rodwell, finish us off, mate.
Thank you very much. Again, don't disagree. I think we need a constitution that actually allows local government to exist, so it can't be just frittered away when the Tories want to destroy, decades, if not centuries of movement, which is really concerning. Without a shadow of a doubt, the best way we can bring Labour back into government is when everyone has a stake in that vision. And it's quite interesting. I believe that every elected member is first and foremost a community leader. When someone says to me, "You're a politician," I always say, "No, I'm not. I'm a community leader or a community champion." I hate the word politician. I think it has been denigrated in a way with all the different scandals that have happened, and the Tories carry on doing it. I have to say that I think we need to raise our game. We need to have the values of what we believe our movement is truly about in the Labour Party, to be able to sell those values in a way that works alongside the values of the community that we represent. So before we are a politician, we are a community champion that facilitates the aspiration of their respective community.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks everyone. Look, we're going to work here with Steve and Hannah and Darren and Anna and everybody, because it's going to be a collective effort. We've got to kind of begin to assemble, the ideas, the practice and the organisations that can make this a national thing. And we need to make it a national thing. So we've got to commit ourselves to doing that. If any one of you are on the call, I want to be involved in that and help, got ideas, thoughts or whatever, get in touch with me or the Compass office or whatever, because we're going to be moving this forward as a kind of ecosystem of people, ideas and organisations that want to make this work. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Steve. And thank you for everyone on the call for listening in and putting in your questions. Look, the progressives grasp, when they grasp modernity, they win elections and they change the country for the better. That's what happened in 1945, based on the Ford factory down in Darren's constituency and borough. You know, that was the sentiment and the nature of that era. The sentiment and nature of this era is the one of Facebookers, one of connections, networks, collaboration and participation, not being told what to do on the production line. If Labour can grasp that sentiment and that culture, then there is massive opportunities, not just to win office, but to win power, so as Steve says, to give it away. And that is the challenge. And we've got 3 or 4 years to develop that. The Tories are going to try and wreck everything between now and then. But we have to both stop them doing that. But more importantly, we've got to develop these ideas, thoughts, practices, networks, cultures, and organizations of a meaningful, radical, modern alternative to what they're doing. We're committed to doing that. We're going to work with everyone to do that. Thanks for your time, taking your time out of your day today to listen to this session. Please work with us. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. See you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.